My wedding ring used to catch the light, all shiny and bright. Now it's dull, just like my marriage. We barely talk anymore, and when we do, it usually ends up in a fight. The other night, dinner was takeout again, cold and greasy. He didn't even look up from his phone the whole time. Later, I fell asleep on the couch alone. It's been like this for months, maybe even years. I still remember the way he used to look at me, like I was the only girl in the world. Those days feel a lifetime away now. The gym is my only escape. Most days it's the usual boring routine, but a few weeks ago, a new guy started. He's got muscles in all the right places, the kind that come from real workouts, not some fancy machine. His eyes are this crazy blue, like some tropical ocean in those travel magazines. Can't help but notice him, you know? At first, it was just quick looks, him checking me out maybe. Then, there were a few smiles. Nothing big, but my heart did a little flutter every time. I started dressing better for the gym, putting in more effort with my hair and a bit of makeup. Silly, I guess, but it gave me a spark I hadn't felt in a long time. Today, he actually went out of his way to accidentally bump into me by the water fountain. "Sorry about that," he said, all low and husky. I swear, my insides went all melty for a second. "No worries," I managed to squeak out. He flashed that killer smile and damn, if I didn't almost forget my own name. Later, while I was doing squats, he came over to help adjust my form. His hands brushed against me, light as a feather, but they sent shivers down my spine. The whole workout, I felt his eyes on me, hot and heavy. It was wrong, I knew that deep down, but it felt so damn good to be noticed again. I couldn't bring myself to care. When I left, I did the unthinkable. I looked back at him, and our eyes locked for one electric second. Then, I practically ran out of there, feeling flushed and a little bit sick with excitement. It was a mix of adrenaline and guilt, a dangerous cocktail that had me buzzing all the way home. That feeling when your phone buzzes late at night, and it's not just some spam text. That's the best. Especially when you know who it's from before you even look. My husband was downstairs, already half asleep in front of some mindless TV show. He never checks my phone, never even suspects a thing. Gym guy, not sure of his real name yet, and I have been texting all week. Innocent stuff at first, then flirty jokes, and now it's getting hot. He says the things I haven't heard in years, that I'm beautiful, exciting, all those things that make you feel good inside. Makes me forget about the empty house and the stale takeout smell clinging to the curtains. Today we finally decided to take it to the next level. Lunch. At that little cafe a few towns over, a place my husband would never go. The drive over was a mix of nerves and excitement. It felt like I was a teenager sneaking out of the house, which was kind of ridiculous but strangely thrilling. We sat at a corner table and pretended to look at the menus we both knew we'd never order from. Our eyes were doing all the talking. He reached across the table, his hand brushing mine. It was such a simple touch, but it sent a jolt through me. We ordered quickly, barely even reading the words. Food was the last thing on my mind. Back in his car, the air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name. "You should come see my apartment," he said, a playful smirk on his lips. My heart slammed against my ribs. Stupid, reckless, crazy, those words screamed in my head, but another part of me was already saying yes. Lying to my husband later was surprisingly easy. Had to help out a friend with a flat tire, got home late, traffic was terrible. The words were just sounds, meaningless noise to cover my tracks. I almost laughed at how simple it was. Almost. Gym guy's apartment wasn't anything special, cluttered, smelled a bit like old protein shakes, but it didn't matter. The moment the door shut, we were all over each other. It was desperate, messy, and exactly what I'd been craving. There was none of the awkwardness of a first time, just raw, urgent need. Afterwards, lying next to him in that too small bed, I felt a pang of guilt, but I shoved it down. This, right now, was what I wanted. The rest could wait. After the first time with Gym Guy, sleep didn't come easy. Guilt twisted in my stomach, making me nauseous. But then I'd remember the feel of his hands on me, his voice low and rough in my ear, and those whispers of how special I was. Those images pushed the guilt down, buried it under a wave of defiant excitement. Our affair became a routine. Stolen lunches, frantic afternoons in his apartment, late-night texts filled with promises. He painted this amazing picture of a future together. A life where I was desired, adored, the center of someone's world. It was intoxicating, especially compared to the dull gray of my marriage. At home, I couldn't even look at my husband without seeing all his flaws. The way he slurped his soup, his lame jokes, even the quiet way he breathed, it all irritated me. Gym guy, on the other hand, seemed perfect. Strong, funny, full of life. The comparison was brutal, unfair even, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. The whispers escalated into concrete plans. Gym guy, whose name, I learned, was Mark, swore he'd leave his crappy job, find a better apartment, do whatever it took to build a life with me. I believed every word, even though part of me recognized the fantasy of it all. But that part was getting smaller and smaller. One night, staring at my husband passed out on the couch, a beer can still in his hand, something inside me snapped. This wasn't just a fling anymore, this was my escape. I went upstairs and stared at the closet full of clothes I didn't even like anymore. Suddenly it felt easy, the only choice to make. Packing was a surreal experience. Each item I folded into my suitcase felt like a betrayal, a bullet aimed at my old life. There were tears, a few moments of panic wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. But then I'd picture Mark, his eager smile and those intense blue eyes, and that fueled me to keep going. In the end, there wasn't even a goodbye note left on the kitchen counter. Just the click of the door behind me as I walked away, the suitcase heavy with stolen freedom. I'm leaving. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and sharp. My husband just stared at me, his mouth slightly open, like a fish gasping for air. I'd never seen him look like that, not angry, exactly, just shocked. For a second, his eyes flickered. Not with understanding, but with pain. Real, raw hurt. It was a look I never wanted to see on his face, but it was too late now. A small, traitorous part of me winced, but I shoved it down. Don't do this, he finally said. His voice was rough. Maybe he was crying? I didn't even want to think about it. But I made myself look at him. I have to, I told him, trying to make my voice firm, unwavering. For him? He spat out the word with disgust. For that gym rat? I flinched. It wasn't fair of him, but it stung. I took a deep breath. It's more than that. This isn't working anymore. I'm not happy, I said. It sounded pathetic and cliched even to my own ears. He just shook his head, then turned away from me. Watching his slumped shoulders, a flicker of doubt crept in, but the fear was stronger. Fear of staying, of letting my whole life turn into a sad rerun of empty nights and takeout dinners. I squared my shoulders and walked out the door, not looking back. Outside, the air was hot and heavy, but even so, it felt like gulping down pure oxygen. I was free, sort of. A wave of nausea hit me, a mix of leftover guilt and a sudden, overwhelming fear of what I'd just done. Mark's apartment wasn't the haven I'd pictured. It was just as cluttered and basic as before, but now that the fantasy had faded, it felt cramped and shabby. Yet the sight of him waiting for me, that bright smile on his face, chased away most of my doubts. This was the right choice, it had to be. We didn't talk much that evening, too busy in a frenzy of passion that felt part desperation, part relief. Only later, as I lay next to him, did a hint of unease settle into my gut. The first fight started over something stupid, a takeout order messed up. His face had twisted into an ugly scowl, and he said things no one should say to someone they supposedly love. In that moment, staring up at him, I saw it, the flash of something dark and controlling underneath the surface charm. The realization hit me cold and hard. Maybe I didn't escape a cage after all. Maybe I just traded it for a different one. The first week was blurry, a mix of bad takeout, too much wine, and a lot of pretending everything was perfect. But at night, when Mark would fall asleep snoring beside me, the truth would come creeping in. The apartment felt suffocating, his touch no longer electric but irritatingly clingy. Sleep wouldn't come. I'd lie awake in his too small bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, and a weird, sick kind of longing would wash over me. I'd think about my old bedroom, the soft sheets, the familiar smell of home, and a pang of regret would slice through me. Was this really better? Then came the news. My friend Sarah texted. Guess who just got the big promotion at work? Way to go, Mike. A photo of my husband, all smiles, holding some dumb award. It felt like someone punched me in the gut. While I was hiding away in this ratty apartment, eating cold pizza off paper plates for dinner, Mike was out there kicking ass at work. He was moving on, building a life filled with things other than me. The unfairness of it made me want to scream. The loneliness was unbearable. Mark had his friends, his crappy job at the gym, and apparently, a bunch of friends, on the side. He'd come home late, smelling of cheap perfume, and barely even tried to hide it. The first time I confronted him, he just laughed, said I was being paranoid. After that, I learned to keep my mouth shut. It wasn't the big, dramatic blow-up I'd expected. It was the slow, painful drip of disappointment. The looks in the grocery store when I was buying food for one. The silence of the apartment echoing with my own emptiness. The worst part was, I had no one to blame but myself. It was my choice, my stupid, selfish choice, and now I had to live with it. Sometimes late at night, I'd stare at my phone, finger hovering over my husband's name. Did he miss me? Did he hate me? Or worse, had he forgotten about me entirely? Pride, or maybe just plain fear, kept me from hitting the call button. The urge came suddenly, a desperate, clawing need to hear his voice. One night, after too many glasses of cheap Chardonnay, I found myself holding the phone, staring at his number. It had been weeks, maybe months. Time had turned blurry and meaningless. Finger shaking, I hit call. It rang once, twice, and then, his voice. It was deeper than I remembered, carrying a hint of hesitation before he said, "Hello? Mike?" I choked out. My voice sounded rusty, unused to speaking his name. "What do you want?" He wasn't yelling, but his tone was ice cold. It cut through me deeper than any angry scream. Tears spilled down my face as I started to babble. Apologies, stupid excuses, begging for another chance. The words tumbled out in a jumbled mess, fueled by wine and desperation. I didn't even know what I wanted from him anymore, just some scrap of kindness. His silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, he spoke. "Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm done. You made your choice, now live with it." But I started to protest, but he cut me off. "I'm happy now. I've even met someone." He paused, just for a second, and that's when I heard it, a woman's laughter, light and carefree, in the background. He had someone new, someone warm and genuine, someone who wasn't me. The realization hit like a freight train. I'd ruined everything. Click. He'd hung up. I sat there clutching the phone, sobs racking my body. Regret gnawed at me, a bitter, acid taste that wouldn't go away. The next morning, walking to the grocery store, I saw Mark across the street. He was with a girl, a beautiful girl, all long blonde hair and easy smiles. They were laughing, holding hands, and the sight of it made me physically sick. It wasn't even jealousy, just a stark reminder that he never loved me the way I dreamed. I was just another conquest, easily replaceable. And for what? I didn't look back at them. Turning away, I walked faster, the weight of my own idiotic choices crushing me with each step. Mark was getting lazy. The same cheesy lines, the same whispered promises that made me roll my eyes now instead of swoon. Then one day, I accidentally stumbled upon his texts with another girl. My stomach twisted. It was the same crap he'd fed me. The "you're so special" stuff, the lies about late nights at work. It was sickeningly familiar. Instead of tears, a jolt of anger shot through me. How dare he? How dare he use me, then do the exact same thing to someone else? That's when the idea started to form. It was childish, petty, probably crazy, but I didn't care. He deserved what was coming. From an anonymous account, I messaged his new girl. Screenshots of their flirty texts. Proof that he had a live-in girlfriend. Me. The whole ugly truth laid out in cold, hard evidence. I even added some juicy details about his gross gym socks that always ended up on the living room floor. It took every ounce of strength to hold back from unleashing a wave of insults, but I kept it factual. Let his own actions do the talking. Then I hit send and waited. It felt like a twisted kind of power, something I hadn't had in a long, long time. A form of closure, even if it was twisted and wrong. Word got back fast. Mark blew up my phone, screaming about betrayal and threats and blah, blah, blah. I ignored him completely. Instead, I listened to the sweet sound of silence ringing through the apartment. A few days later, a mutual friend let slip that Mark's new girl had dumped him. A surge of satisfaction washed over me, petty, childish satisfaction, but it felt damn good anyway. He got a taste of his own medicine, and maybe, just maybe, that girl was spared what I had foolishly endured. The victory was fleeting though. In the weeks that followed, the apartment felt emptier than ever. The truth settled heavy in my chest. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired and desperately, achingly sad. Days turned into weeks, each one blurring into the next. Mark kicked up a fuss about me trashing his new relationship, but eventually he left me alone. It wasn't the grand showdown I'd secretly hoped for, just a string of pathetic, angry texts before he disappeared. In the end, we both lost. The apartment, once a haven from the world, now felt like a prison cell. Each corner held a ghost of broken promises and stale excuses. Without the distraction of anger, the emptiness settled over me like a suffocating fog. I was adrift, completely alone. One afternoon, I found myself wandering aimlessly. My feet somehow led me to our old coffee shop, the one Mike and I used to frequent on Saturday mornings before life got so complicated. Pushing the door open, the smell of roasted coffee beans and warm pastries hit me with a wave of unexpected nostalgia. The place was just the same. Cozy wooden tables, the chalkboard with its quirky daily specials, even the same barista with the bright pink hair. It was all a painful reminder of a life I'd thrown away so recklessly. I ordered our usual, a latte for him, a cappuccino for me, and took a seat by the window. Memories of our early years together flooded my mind. The laughter, the shared dreams, the way he used to look at me like I was the only thing that mattered. Biting back a sob, I sipped my cappuccino. It tasted bitter, like regret. Tears blurred my vision as I stared out at the bustling street. People strolled by, laughing with friends, holding hands with their partners. I'd never felt more disconnected and alone in my entire life. Leaving the half-finished coffee on the table, I got up and walked out the door. In that moment, I realized I couldn't hide away from the world anymore. As painful as it was, I had to face the consequences of my choices. I had to start picking up the shattered pieces of my life, even if I didn't know how, even if it took forever. I needed to start finding my way back, one shaky step at a time. The gym was always a last resort. The air thick with sweat, the grunts and groans of people pushing their limits. It was all a reminder of my spectacular failures. But with my bank account hitting dangerously low numbers, I desperately needed a job, and the "help wanted" sign had been glaring at me for weeks. Swallowing my pride, I marched in and applied. To my horror, who should be manning the front desk but Mark? His eyes widened when he saw me, a flicker of guilt washing over his cocky expression. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, all those ugly memories rushing back at once. I must have looked pathetic, standing there in faded workout clothes, hair scraped back, makeup non-existent. A sharp contrast to the polished, perky girls in matching sports bras he probably dated now. I made a mistake, I managed to choke out. It wasn't some grand apology, just a raw admission of the truth hanging heavy in the air. His expression was unreadable. Maybe he was angry, maybe he just didn't care. Eventually, he simply turned away and started shuffling papers on his desk, clearly dismissing me. But then, something unexpected happened. "Wait," he said quietly. Reaching under the desk, he pulled out a tissue box and slid it awkwardly across the counter towards me. I'd been trying to hold back tears, and I guess my face was a mess. It was such a small gesture, that in that moment, it felt surprisingly kind. Taking the tissues, I mumbled a thanks and retreated to a deserted corner of the gym. After blowing my nose and wiping my eyes, I noticed a park bench outside, just under the shade of a big tree. I headed there, needing a moment to gather myself. Unexpectedly, a few minutes later, Mark joined me on the bench. The silence stretched out, awkward and heavy. I couldn't bring myself to look at him directly, choosing instead to focus on a chipped piece of paint on the bench's armrest. Breaking the tension, Mark finally spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "About everything. I know it doesn't mean much now, but I was an idiot." His apology opened a door I didn't know was even there. Words started to flow, at first hesitant, then in a torrent of pent-up regrets and shared heartbreak. We talked about everything: my blindness, his selfishness, the crushing loneliness that followed in the wake of our mutual betrayal. It wasn't pretty. There were awkward silences, choked back sobs, and accusations flung across the space between us. Yet, as the afternoon sun began to dip below the trees, something shifted. The weight of anger and resentment started to ease, replaced by an unexpected sense of understanding. Or maybe it was just exhaustion. We didn't make any promises. No grand declarations of getting back together. We both knew that ship had sailed a long time ago. But there was an acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance that we had both screwed up, and we both had been hurt. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a start. As I walked away, Mark called out my name. I turned, half expecting some last-minute plea or a renewal of old arguments. But all he said was, "Take care of yourself." It was so simple, and yet, it felt more genuine than anything he'd said in a very long time. In my heart, a flicker of something stirred. Not hope, those days were behind me. But maybe it was possibility, a sense that the slate wasn't entirely wiped clean, but it wasn't covered in unsalvageable damage either. With a surge of determination, I decided to make a symbolic gesture. Days later, I walked into a jewelry store, the kind I used to pass with Mike, admiring the sparkly rings I'd never buy for myself. This time, I didn't look at the diamond-studded bands. Instead, I chose a plain silver ring, simple and unadorned. It wasn't about finding someone new, but about finding myself again. Slipping it onto my finger, it felt like a silent promise of a fresh start. The future remained a blank page, terrifying in its emptiness, but for the first time in ages, that emptiness didn't feel completely hopeless. It felt like an opportunity. Pen_spark. I wouldn't let my mistakes define me. This time, I'd rebuild my life on my own terms, piece by painstaking piece. It would be lonely, hard, and filled with uncertainty, but it would